Welcome to the book launch for The People Make the Peace, Lessons from the Vietnam Anti-War Movement, edited by Karin, Angiular-San and Frank Joyce. Hi, my name is Doug Hostetter. I am the director of the United Methodist Office. I'm the director of the Mennonite Central Committee, United Nations Office, but actually got my start doing the anti-war movement here with the United Methodist Office, which is donating this room today. The Methodist actually hired me right after I came back from Vietnam, doing my alternative service in Vietnam with the Mennonite Central Committee in the middle of the war, in the middle of a war zone, but helping children learn to read and write their own language. I wanted to also announce to everybody, we have a number of cameras here in the room. C-SPAN is covering it. So when we get to the question and answer period, I will ask you to wait until the mic comes to you so that you can be heard by the audience that will be watching on television later on. Thank you very much, and welcome to today's book launch.
Make this fit my height. Here we are for The People Make the Peace. This is a really exciting moment for me and Frank. Frank is in Detroit, I believe, right now. We are splitting up events. Some go to the East Coast, some go to the West Coast. So I'm very lucky to be here. I want to first tell a little bit about the series of fortuitous events that produced this book. In 2006, I went on a tour of Vietnam led by Erwin Marquette, and I met Frank Joyce and Marianne Barnett. We became friends, and on the way home, he mentioned that he lived in Detroit, and so we had a connection because I also spend some time in Detroit. I brought students there. I think Detroit is a really interesting example of rebuilding and respiriting a city that has been abandoned. And Frank mentioned that he had a lot of friends in the anti-war movement. And I said, well, if you have all these friends, why don't you collect them, and I'll help you make a book about it. I wasn't necessarily thinking he would follow up. But it was another great fortune that happened in the next few years when Frank met up with John McAuliff, and I believe it was 2010. And Frank and John had had a background in the civil rights movement and had established one of those friendships where when you see each other years later, you're still connected. And he thought, I want to bring John into this because between Frank and John, they remember many of the people who went to Vietnam during the war as what we now call citizen diplomats or people's diplomats. Non-journalists, non-combatants who went to bear witness to the war because they didn't trust what was being told to them by the Pentagon, and they wanted to see in a first-hand way what was happening. So in 2011 and 2012 started our weekly series of phone calls that seemed to go forever. It seemed like we were phone calling each other for decades. Every week we'd call each other, and it was fascinating for me. I mostly took notes as Frank and John excavated from their own personal memories the people they knew that went on these trips. There were 200 we know in all. According to some sources, more than 200. We recuperated the names of about 50 people still living who were accessible by phone, email, or Facebook. And with a little help from the right-wing KeyWiki site, which has also a very accurate list of names, which they call the Hanoi Lobby. And they presume that people are going as spies. But we know, or we propose the other idea, that people went as independent observers. And we collected these names and we invited people to go on a trip. That trip ended up being in January 2013, and John was helpful in facilitating that trip to be timed with the Vietnamese official commemorations of the Paris Peace Accord, the 40th anniversary of the signing of the Paris Peace Treaty. So that was an important way for these activists, they called them veterans of the peace movement, actually, veterans of the anti-war movement, to connect again to their friends in Vietnam. That's the core of the book. We also invited Myra McPherson to include her chapter interviewing 5 ex-combatant veterans who returned to Vietnam to live there as a form of reparations, to give back to the country that they were originally fighting. I also made a fortuitous connection to Professor Judy Wu, who's the author of Radicals on the Road, a very important history of the people of color who went to Vietnam during this time. So of the 200, there was a core group, there were a group of people of color who traveled not only to Vietnam, but also to China and North Korea. Professor Wu interviewed Pat Sumi and Alex Hing, and lucky for us, Alex Hing wanted to join our trip in January 2013. Doug Hostetter joined us in somewhat of a different category because he didn't go as an independent observer, but instead, as he'll tell you in his story, he went as a conscientious objector and spent time in South Vietnam, which is a very different experience. He then played a key role in the creation of the People's Peace Treaty, and that's also a very unique contribution of this book. There is, so far as we know, no firsthand account of the People's Peace Treaty, a student-oriented initiative. Then as we pulled the proposal together for the book, it was Doug who connected us to Helena. And we're so lucky to be connected to a press, Just World Books, that considers itself or aspires to be a vehicle for international understanding and peace. That's the exact spirit that we hope that this book is read in. And their commitments have been, tremendous. Anyone who's published a book, there's all kinds of dramas that happen at the last minute, and you wouldn't believe how Diana and Kim and Helena were there, were incredibly patient. I have to call you in the middle of the night to explain to you this problem that I forgot something, and so we're very, very grateful to the work that you've done for us. As editors, Frank Joyce and I recognize that there's a big gap in the understanding of what the anti-war movement did, and what it was trying to do, and what its aspirations were in the 1960s and 1970s. So the idea of this book is to make concrete those very intricate and subtle decisions and perspectives that people who saw themselves as part of this movement made. A number of books have talked a little bit about this. I mentioned Radicals on the Road. Mary Hershberger wrote a book called Traveling for Peace, in which she did a more close study of the travelers. Penny Lewis did a book called Hard Hats, Hawks, and Hippies, in which she explained why it is that we think of the anti-war movement now as a middle-class elite activity, when in fact it was a very broad-based movement, including working-class people of all colors. That's a really important message we want you to pick up from this book, which is the diversity of the movement, a diversity that you will see even today as you hear these perspectives. We have so much to learn from hearing from Alex, John, and Doug, and their contemporaries, to learn about their choices, to learn about how they reconciled the choices that they had to make, what trade-offs there were, especially how do they think now about what they did then. And you'll hear a little bit, too, about how people orient themselves towards Vietnam today. There are some missing points of view from this book. We won't pretend that this is any kind of comprehensive view. Many people in the movement could not afford to treat the Vietnam War as the single issue that they would work on. Many communities saw the war as connected to poverty, racism, and other issues that were going on here. In the civil rights movement, it was very difficult for people to just isolate the war as their only issue. So you will see that there's some connections we need to make today to include all people in the movements for peace and justice. The other view that is not here for reasons that you will understand, but that I think we can include in the conversation, are the refugee perspectives. Those people who came after the war, often as allies of the United States, or as people, we don't choose the sides of the war that we're in often, as people who came as a result of the end of the war. So those perspectives are something that we will bring in as this book proceeds to be read and discussed in the community. As I told Helena, now that the book is out, we have a long journey together with Just World Books and each other to continue the messages and conversations about the legacy and the lessons of the anti-war movement. So with this, I'll turn it over to John.
And you want about 10 minutes, right? Okay. Well, thank you all for coming this morning. Thank you for C-SPAN. I go through periods of addiction with C-SPAN, which it's hard not to get caught up, and then I say, no, I've got another life. But in any case, it plays an important role in maybe not so much for the lives of the media-inundated East Coast, Northeast world, but of folks in the rest of the country who get an insight into all of the conversations that we are constantly involved in. So thank you to C-SPAN for its role, and thank you to the publisher for taking our sometimes inchoate presentations, and thanks especially, the person I dealt with most was Frank Joyce, who first of all wouldn't let me avoid it, since there are always 7,000 other things to do, but then kept pushing for focus and tightening of what I was writing about. And had done this, started out with an interview that was done by one of the members of the group, and so turning an interview into something that was more coherent. I'm not going to try to recapitulate all of what is in my chapter. What I want to do is focus on something that links for me the past to the present, not just for Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia, but also where my work has largely been focused in the last 15 or so years, which is Cuba. You'll see a wonderful picture on page 175 that I took in Hanoi on April 30th, 1975. By pure accident, we arrived in Hanoi literally within hours of the time that the U.S. ambassador was leaving Saigon, Graham Martin. We had missed a plane in Bangladesh, so the result heightened the dramatic moment. It was me and another Quaker staff person and others from the Indochina Peace Campaign, which we worked very closely with. So we were in this culminating moment of what had been, for many of us, all of our late teens or years in our 20s and early 30s, what had helped probably defined us. I mean, some of us had started out in the civil rights movement and already had that. I had added Peace Corps onto that. But then it was the Vietnam experience, the learning what it meant about what our country was and its ability to not understand history and what it was doing in the world, but also to learn about what motivated folks who had seized history and were determined that that history was theirs as a small, we think of Vietnam as a small country. It's, of course, now 90 million people. And it's never been a tiny country. Laos is a tiny country. Cambodia is a tiny country. But Vietnam always was, and I think always will be, even more so now, a key focal point, a word that Tom Hayden introduced us to in the course of our work. a key focal point for the politics of the region, internationally and regionally. And to understand Vietnam and our relationship to it, I think you go back to a phrase that Ho Chi Minh used, that we used to quote, and maybe we understood, maybe we didn't, but it was, "Nothing is more precious than independence and freedom." Now, Americans see that phrase and think civil rights or civil liberties. When the Vietnamese and much of the world that was freeing itself from colonialism used that concept, they were talking about national independence and national freedom, something that we once felt very strongly, but as we became a well-established, comfortable, dominant world power, we sort of lost track of why other people would feel that. And we see it even till today in terms of the Middle East. There were several contradictions that, I'd say the experience of being in Vietnam, I like to, at that particular moment in history, I like to say set the hook, that it determined the rest of my life, in effect, because it was hard not to be there and realize that the story was not over, and that I, in particular, had entered into a particular moment, and that determined what I might contribute professionally or intellectually and spiritually with my life. And it put me in contact with a lot of people who still, some of them are still alive, many have passed as time goes on, but people who were very important in my understanding myself and my world. So I entered into this process. Remember 1975, the US was the top of the pile. I mean, we had the conflict with the Soviet Union, but we were the world power, and we had never lost a war. Well, we lost a war, and we then had to rationalize how we'd lost it, and of course blamed the people who had beaten us. We started out, it was interesting, if you looked at polls at the time, maybe 2/3, 60%, 65% of Americans who had been against the war wanted to do something to help the people in Vietnam, especially, but when they thought about it, Laos and Cambodia, that had been the initial impulse. And the process was actually almost achieved by the Carter administration. Remember, early in the Carter administration, a delegation was sent, led by Leonard Woodcock, who was at that point president of the UAW, the United Auto Workers. They had the capacity to reach an agreement and normalize relations. And just think of that, in what is it, 1976, 77, I forget what the year was they went, but they could have walked away with normal relations for Vietnam. It was the Vietnamese that wouldn't do it because they believed morally, politically, that the U.S. owed assistance for reconstruction. They made a political calculation, which I think to this day they regret, and have said that, at least privately, that they could hold back, and there was enough pressure coming from the U.S., from the former anti-war sentiment, that they would be able to get reconstruction aid. Well, it was a terrible error. By the time they changed their position, the Carter administration had changed its position and had become much more interested in building a relationship with China against the Soviet Union. And so, you know, Nguyen Co Thach, the foreign minister of Vietnam, was here in New York with Dick Holbrooke negotiating normalization of relations, and it never happened because the U.S. walked away from it. So from the late 70s until 1995, we lived in this period in which, I mean, I remember early conversations in Washington remember, it was not just the military. A lot of civilians who'd been in the State Department, who'd been in USAID programs, for whom their lives were also shaped by the war. But they had personal relationships with people who were terribly damaged by the end of the war, some of whom were the refugee population, some of whom were incarcerated in work-study programs, some of whom died trying to leave the country. So they had not just the resentment, the anger at the Vietnamese for having won the war, and of course, having done it in nasty ways or we wouldn't have been beaten, but they had this personal link to folks who had been negatively affected. So the problem was, how did you, if my goal was to bring about normal relations, how do you work in that milieu? Again, remember, the religious community had been a marvelously important factor in the anti-war movement. Well, whether by intention or by accident, when we resettled hundreds of thousands of refugees from Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, they were put exactly into the religious community that had been against the war. And so everybody is hearing about the three countries from the people who are most embittered about the three countries. And so it was one of the factors that wound up unwinding this very strong sentiment in favor of normalization. So we had to deal with contradictions. Okay. One contradiction was justice versus reconciliation. Justice was that we had devastated not just the numbers of deaths. I mean, we lost 56,000. Vietnam lost 2 to 3 million. Cambodia, if you count the KR period, lost 2 to 3 million. Laos, a tiny country, probably lost 500,000. But also we left behind landmines and unexploded ordnance and Agent Orange. In other words, the effect of the war was still going on. A lot of people on the left, as they approached the issue, wanted justice, wanted the U.S. to acknowledge its wrongness, its evil, its horribleness historically, and pay compensation. Well, clearly that was not the path to reconciliation. The second was the difference between national interest and ideology. Again, the left had elevated the Vietnamese especially into super people. You know, it's very hard to walk an even line, especially when you sympathize with the victims of your own country. But one of the things that happened was that in this country, the Vietnamese were superheroes, and well, the Vietnamese fought because they wanted their independence and freedom. They fought for their national interest. They didn't fight for a textbook ideology. They adopted an ideology because they needed it to get material assistance from Russia and China, rather than that they were, if you read their political stuff, it was pretty routine, what's the right words? It just wasn't very interesting or ideologically creative. They just did what they had to do. The other final contradiction, which even continues till today, is national development versus equity. Again, our viewpoint from the left, from the progressive community, emphasizes equity. And in fact, that was one of the reasons the Vietnamese won their revolution, because they were able to combine national independence with social equity within the country. But look at Vietnam today. Very high growth rate, very, very important factor. I would guess in 20 years it will be the most important country in Southeast Asia, both economically and politically. But they have the same problems that everybody else has with rapid development, which is the difference between the people at the top who are driving expensive cars and are now are involved with tremendous amount of personal advance, family advance, and people who are left out of the picture, especially in rural areas. It's a choice they made. It's a choice they're very conscious about. And I guess the last thing I'd say is that the irony of all this is we went into Vietnam because we wanted to stop Chinese expansion into Southeast Asia? Well, as Bob McNamara acknowledged later, if anybody had read the least bit of history, they would have known that the one country that could be depended on to stop Chinese expansion into Southeast Asia was Vietnam. And that's where we are today. The US and Vietnam could not be closer in terms, you know, the party general secretary from Vietnam visits the White House. The president doesn't usually see party leaders. He visits the president for an hour. He comes out of it talking about how the key thing about why the relationship is so strong is that the U.S. accepted the difference, respected the difference, respected that Vietnam was not going to be the United States in terms of democracy and civil rights and human rights. It was going to have its own path, and we were not going to insist on internal change in Vietnam because we had much larger issues between us, in particular the regional issue of China. Which brings me as a last word to Cuba. We haven't quite gotten there yet. The president has taken important steps, and really important steps, but there's still a contradictory psychology in Washington, and whether those steps are, and the Cubans feel this very strongly, whether those steps are simply a smarter way to do the same stuff, to do regime change, or whether it is, in fact, like Vietnam, an acceptance, a mutual respect that we don't agree with what they're doing, but they have the right to do it. Again, nothing is more precious than independence and freedom.
Thank you. That was John McAuliff, and his chapter in The People Make the Peace is called The Making of a People's Diplomat. So now I want to introduce Alex Hing, whose chapter is called Journey to the East.
Hi. I'm really excited to be here. You know, I'm just a worker. I'm a chef at the hotel across the street. If you were around when our restaurant was open, you know what we can do, okay? So I've never written anything that got into a book. I've written pamphlets. You know, I'm an organizer. I've written articles. And to see my work in a book by Just World, everyone should get a copy and distribute it to their friends. Hopefully what I say could be of use. Now, I don't know what you're supposed to do at a book launching. I thought you're supposed to read from it. So I've come prepared to do that. But my chapter basically reflects upon how Vietnam affected me as a person, as a human being. And so I want to talk a little bit about that. When I was 16 years old, I made a decision to dedicate my life to world peace and ending war. And at that time, I was in what we call now the pipeline to prison. And I thought that to give my life a purpose, I would choose that and work on that for the rest of my life. But I always understood that working for world peace also means that we have to address oppression in, like my community, and communities of color in the United States and also the third world. Because it's the same powers that cause war, that cause racial oppression, economic oppression. So with that, I'll say, I'll read this. In 1970, when I first visited Vietnam, I was a 24-year-old revolutionary nationalist. Vietnam, along with China, helped to shape my identity. As a Chinese American, I was part of a very small nationality in the United States, barely 1%, and oftentimes listed as others, along with Asians from other countries, Pacific Islanders, and American Indians. Life in San Francisco's Chinatown was similar to that of African Americans. I lived in a ghetto. We had the highest suicide and tuberculosis rates in the nation. Jobs for youth were very hard to come by. There were very few public places to hang out since Chinatown had the second highest density population in the nation, and my generation was the baby boomers. Racist tourists would trample through our community looking at us as something exotic, women as sex objects, men as boys, meek and passive. Chinatown was politically and economically controlled by the reactionary KMT, the Kuomintang, from Taiwan, and America's stifling culture on its coming-of-age generation was exacerbated in Chinatown by Confucianism. The police did the bidding of the KMT and targeted youth who strayed from the stereotypical norm, namely those of us who hung out in the pools halls of Manila town on the edge of Chinatown. My buddies and I kept track of the civil rights movement. In high school, we felt more akin to blacks than to whites. The war in Vietnam looked very much like genocide waged by a racist government against the people who looked just like us. So, war and oppression in the community, what links them is capitalism, and particularly U.S. finance capitalism that generates imperialism. Capitalism cannot exist. The premise of capitalism is inequality, and from that comes exploitation, comes oppression, comes misery, comes death. So as I came to address these issues, I came to understand that in order to have a world where there is no war, we also have to have a world where there is no money. So if you think like that, you are a revolutionary, because who thinks like that? So I decided that I would become a revolutionary and proceeded to do different activities in my community. And working in that vein, I became close to the Black Panther Party. Has anyone seen the movie that's out now? If not, go see it. It's only going to be out for a few days. And yeah. And so I was fortunate enough to go on a Black Panther Party delegation led by Eldridge Cleaver to North Vietnam. We also went to North Korea, China, and Algiers. We were known as the People's Anti-Imperialist Delegation. So, you know, we went to Vietnam and, you know, in the midst of the war, and we saw what the criminal U.S. government was doing. And we were welcome as diplomats wherever we went. So the thing that we learned, and the thing we need to understand, is that, from my book, from my chapter, the Vietnamese used an international strategy to win support for the demands at the Paris peace negotiations and to isolate the United States. The U.S. anti-war movement was a key part of that strategy. If the anti-war movement continued to grow, eventually the government would have to consider public opinion in order for the politicians to stay in power. One of the problems was that very little information was available to the U.S. public about what was going on in Paris or what the demands of the PRG were. Returning war veterans brought information about the U.S. conduct of the war, but visits to the PRG in Paris and Hanoi by anti-war activists were also critical. Support for the PRG demands for an immediate U.S. ceasefire and total withdrawal of U.S. troops had to be intentionally mobilized. While battlefield losses and casualties were the main reasons for ending the war, the justness of the Vietnamese cause and hence the correctness of their demands had to be presented to the U.S. public. So those of us who went to Vietnam and had contact with the Vietnamese, we felt that it was our obligation to support the demands that were being put forward in Paris by the Vietnamese. So for those of us from our stripe of the anti-war movement, we supported what we called victory to the Vietnamese. and our chant was, you know, Ho, ho, Ho Chi Minh, Vietnam is going to win. Okay? So we were very clear where we stood. And when we came back, we did some work, and I think this is one thing in this book, my chapter, I'm the only person of color to contribute to this book, and I think that's important because I bring a perspective to it from my experience in the anti-war movement. Okay, so we had a legal apparatus to deal with the criminal justice system. So some of us formed the Asian Legal Services in a storefront in the International Hotel. Besides criminal services, we did immigration service, income tax, and draft counseling. Our draft counseling was well known. Anyone who did not want to go into the military would not be drafted. We had processed approximately 1,000 cases, even obtaining conscientious objector status for 4 active Asian American servicemen. Through the draft counseling, we formed the Bay Area Asian Coalition Against the War in close relationship with the Union of Vietnamese. BACAL was a grassroots organization representing Asian Pacific communities throughout Northern California to support the PRG's demands at the Paris Peace Conference. In anti-war marches, the BACAL contingent would snake dance and chant, "One struggle, many fronts." We believed the slogan, "Bring our troops home," was racist because it applied only to U.S. troops and not without any consideration to the Vietnamese who bore the brunt of the war suffering. At one anti-war demonstration in San Francisco, a group of Asian women from BACAL took over the stage to promote the PRG's 7-point peace proposal to applause of many in the audience. So, you know, like we're saying, that the anti-war movement was vast. It encompasses many, many sectors of the American people. But the contributions of people of color have not been recognized. And also, from our point of view, there was an element of racism within the anti-war movement itself. So these are things that we have to come to grip with if we want to understand and rebuild a movement that is stronger and more solid today. So, you know, the other thing that's important is that we built this anti-war support for the Vietnamese in our communities among working class, middle class people. The Japanese American Citizens League had the ladies there had a bowling group. And so this bowling group, they all joined BACAL, which meant that they support the PRG's demands, and they had a bowling tournament to raise funds to send to Bach Mai Hospital. Now, these are little old Japanese ladies doing bowling. They're raising money. Every pin drop was some money that was going to be sent to Bach Mai Hospital, to rebuild Bach Mai Hospital. So that was the kind of movement that we built.
One more minute.
Okay. So, yeah, read the book, okay? So what I want to say is that, you know, we do have a long way to go, and in the course of my life, whenever I face any difficulty, I've always looked to the Vietnamese and to the spirit of the Vietnamese to encourage me to keep going, because we have a long way to go in our struggle for world peace, and I think a big piece of that now is to end global warming by keeping fossil fuels in the ground, and we need to build a movement as broad and as deep as the anti-war movement in order to do that. Okay, so thank you.
So that was Alex Hing. His chapter is called Journey to the East. Now I want to introduce you to Doug Hostetter, our host for this space. Doug Hostetter's chapter is called A Pacifist in the War Zone. He also contributes to another co-written chapter on the People's Peace Treaty. So here's Doug Hostetter.
Thank you. My experience in Vietnam was very much shaped by going there to do my alternative service for the military, working with the Mennonite Central Committee in Vietnam, and meeting the Vietnamese up close in a different way than any American GI was ever able to meet them. My work was doing literacy with Vietnamese children whose schools had been destroyed by the American Air Force and whose teachers, who I organized, were Vietnamese high school students. The Mennonite Central Committee is a pacifist organization, and it was very interesting. At the end of the war, there were 130 non-government organizations working in Vietnam, all of which said they were there to serve the Vietnamese people. When the American troops left, 128 of the non-government organizations left, and only the Quakers and the Mennonites, peace churches, stayed and continued the work. The Mennonite Central Committee is continuing to work in Vietnam even in today, dealing with some of the legacy issues of Agent Orange and helping the people who several generations later are still dealing with deformities and cancers caused by the dropping of Agent Orange in Vietnam. This morning I wanted to talk primarily about the other chapter that I contributed towards, which was the People's Peace Treaty. I think it was one of the most unique aspects of the anti-war movement, which is not well understood or written about. And I was privileged to be a part of the People's Peace Treaty. I knew a Quaker who was involved on the edge of this, and she called me up and said, there has to be a Vietnamese speaker that is involved in the U.S. National Student Association delegation that's planning to go to South Vietnam and North Vietnam to negotiate. None of them speak Vietnamese. It would be critical to have a Vietnamese speaker on the delegation, and she said, if you're willing, I think I can help to get you on. So I was actually added to the delegation of student body presidents and campus newspaper editors from across the country that decided that in the summer of 1970, at the National Student Association Convention, decided that they would send a delegation to try to negotiate a peace treaty between the students in the South, the students in the North, and American students. Now, just to give you a bit of the framework of that era, this was right after the expansion of the war into Cambodia, the killings of the students at Kent State and at Jackson State, the American War, the American negotiations in Paris had been going on for 2 years, and the only thing that they had been able to agree on is the composition of the two sides and the shape of the table. We as students decided that we would try to do what our political leaders were unable to do. And this was possible partly because of some really unique aspects of the Vietnamese people. They truly are amazing people. At the beginning of the Vietnam War, the Vietnamese government in the North established a committee of friendship with the American people at the beginning of the war. And during the war, at least 300 people from the United States traveled to Vietnam to meet with Vietnamese people, members of the peace community in the U.S. Were welcomed in Hanoi, were helped to see what the situation was like there, developed authentic friendships. I'm one of the few Americans who can say, I know what it's like to be under the American Air Force when they're bombing. and when your hosts immediately tell you that a plane has been spotted and you need to all quickly run for the bomb shelter. This was an amazing experience. At the beginning, when the National Student Association told the State Department that we hoped to do this delegation to negotiate peace with students, the U.S. State Department said, of course, we will be glad to facilitate things. We would obviously work with the Saigon regime to get visas for everybody to come to South Vietnam for part of this negotiations. But then they discovered that actually North Vietnam had agreed that they would also give us visas. And suddenly everything changed at the State Department. And they came to us and they said, we're sorry, we're not certain that visas will be granted anymore. And we discovered that anybody who traveled to South Vietnam in the autumn of 1970 and listed student as their profession was denied a visa to get into South Vietnam. Because I had been identified late with the delegation, it was decided that my name would be left off the official list of the delegates who were going to go to South Vietnam, and that I would travel several days before the official delegation was supposed to go. And as I was a graduate student in sociology, I traveled as a sociologist on vacation, got my visa, and 3 days later, when the official NSA delegation arrived at Saigon, all of them were denied. We then went on, so I spent about a week in South Vietnam. Let me just read one quick quote from this. This will give you a better idea of who the Vietnamese people are than probably anything else I could read. This was my first night in Saigon with a Vietnamese cab driver in Vietnamese, and I wrote this in my journal. He responded to me, "You Americans can do what you want. Eventually, you will have to withdraw, just like the French after 80 years. You can bomb all you want. We will fill up the holes and continue as before. You can bring in all the troops you want. Eventually, you will have to leave. We will stay here. You can bring all the money you want. You can buy some Vietnamese. But you can't buy their hearts. You might be able to buy a Vietnamese woman for a night. You might be able to even ask her to marry you. But when you get on the plane, she will stay here. Whatever you do, eventually you are going to have to leave, and we will stay here. Vietnam is ours in the end." We went on to, after several days in meeting with the Saigon Student Union, and they were very eager to negotiate a treaty of peace with the students in the South and the students in the North. Actually, it was a quite simple treaty. It essentially said the Americans need to leave, and the Vietnamese will resolve their problems among themselves. It was quite straightforward and easy to understand. And actually, the students in the South, the students in the North, and the students in the U.S. all agreed. After being in South Vietnam for a week, I was to travel to Bangkok and then on to Hanoi to join with the rest of the delegation. The Saigon Student Union said, we need to do a press conference before you leave, because if you do not do a press conference, we know the media will say, this was all negotiated in Hanoi. Nobody actually came. There were no South Vietnamese students involved in this negotiations. And I said, you know, we do a press conference. It'll be all right during the press conference, but the next day when I go through the Saigon immigration, I will probably disappear and never be heard from again. So we struggled for a while, and finally it was decided we would do a secret press conference. And I said, well, what is a secret press conference? And they said, well, we know who the very trusted reporters are. And we will invite one or two of the Vietnamese trusted reporters and one or two of the American trusted reporters. I don't remember who the Vietnamese were, but I remember the Christian Science Monitor reporter, Dan Sutherland, was the only American that passed the Saigon Student Union criteria to come to a secret press conference. What we hadn't accounted for was, and they agreed to come to the press conference and hold their stories until after I was out of the country on my way to Hanoi. What we hadn't figured out was that the CIA would actually pick it up off the wire before I actually got the whole way to Hanoi. So I flew to Bangkok, spent the night in Bangkok, and then on to Vientiane, where I was to meet some journalist friends of mine. And I walked into the Hotel Constellation where the journalists all hung out, and immediately my friend from Dispatch News Services came running up and he said, "Have they found you yet?" I said, "What do you mean, have they found you yet?" He said, the Laotian police are looking for you. They came up to a guy who had a mustache that looked something like you a few minutes ago, and when he said he wasn't Doug Hostetter, they asked him to produce his passport to prove that he wasn't. So he said, if you're carrying anything that you wouldn't want them to get, you might want to get rid of it quickly. So I quickly gave the copy of the People's Peace Treaty to my journalist friend, went back to my hotel, and 3 minutes later, there were 4 Laotian police that came in and wanted to go through everything, inspect all of my luggage, and they went through everything. I remember even taking apart my ballpoint pen to look for secret messages inside. They were at a real disadvantage. They didn't know what they were looking for. They didn't speak Vietnamese. They spoke only broken English, but they knew that they were supposed to get something, and I had lots of papers. They took lots of papers, and in the end, the lieutenant colonel who was in charge says, "We search just like they do in the United States." I was trained in Fort Knox. So we came back to the United States. We first did our press conference in Paris to announce it, because we were concerned about trying to announce it in the U.S. first. We wanted to make sure that we were able to actually announce the People's Peace Treaty. And then we brought it back for signing and endorsing by student body presidents, by student bodies themselves, or by student councils. The timing was actually perfect for this. It was right after all of the outrage of Kent State and Jackson State. It was right at the time of the Winter Soldier hearings and the demonstrations in Washington of the veterans. And it had an amazing impact in schools during that period when we first came back. I'll try to look at just a couple of the okay. We ended up with having 188 different colleges and universities processing it on their campuses and discussing it. We had endorsements from all of the major peace organizations, everything from the city councils, including Cambridge City Council, Massachusetts, Berkeley, Detroit, Ann Arbor, 300 colleges and universities signed the treaty. 10 schools had offered school-wide referendums, and by April 21st, 1971, the National People's Peace Treaty Office had received word that 188 more colleges and universities would vote on the treaty before the end of the school year. And then finally, it was introduced into the U.S. Congress in April of 1970 as a sense of a congressional sense of, be it resolved, that the House of Representatives, the Senate concurring, it is the sense of Congress that the People's Peace Treaty embodies the legitimate aspirations of the American and Vietnamese peoples for an enduring and just peace. That was introduced by Congressional Representative Bella Abzug, Herman Badillo, Shirley Chisholm, Bill Clay, John Conyers, Ron Dillams, Farron Mitchell, and James Schnur. So we worked at the grassroots, we worked at the top, we showed our government that peace was actually possible. Unfortunately, the US government waited for 2 more years. Tens of thousands of Americans died, hundreds of thousands of Indo-Chinese died during those 2 years. And in the end, the Paris Peace Accords essentially said the same thing. The Americans will leave, and the Vietnamese will solve their problems among themselves. I thank you.
So we're here to celebrate the launching of The People Make the Peace, a new book from Just World Books. And we'd like to hear your questions and comments. And won't you please direct them to either John McAuliff, Doug Hostetter, or Alex Hing. And I believe there's a microphone so we can actually hear and record your thoughts. So please share something.
Hi, we're high school seniors, and last year we learned about the Vietnam War, but a big part of the narrative was the capitalism versus communism aspect, and getting this new perspective from you three, that was lacking from the conversation. So we were hoping, how present was that issue in your experience during the Vietnam War and the anti-war movement?
Well, having spent 3 years living in a small village in Tam Kỳ, Quang Nam, in central Vietnam, I can tell you that most of the people who fought the Americans they hadn't read Marx, Lenin, Mao, or any of the great Marxist writers. They really didn't know about communism. What they did know was that Americans were dropping bombs on their communities, that American planes were defoliating the rice fields, that foreigners that looked a lot like the French that had been the colonial power before were back again in their country trying to dominate. And the longer we stayed and the more we bombed, the more people we created who wanted to fight against us. And it was not ideological. It was their country, and they hated anybody, French, American, Chinese, anybody who wanted to come in and dominate them.
I think when I was active, as a revolutionary, still am a revolutionary, by the way. I think if you believe in world peace, you're a revolutionary, right? Because that's not how everyone thinks. That there was this ideological divide in the world between Marxism, Leninism, and capitalism. But as we see what actually happened in Vietnam and what happened in China, what happened in the Soviet Union, you have to ask yourself, well, what is it anyway? Because all those 3 countries are capitalists now. So what's the problem? It's not communism, it's capitalism, right? So I think that was of the way that the war was framed in the media and the way the world powers looked at it. But in essence, the struggle in Vietnam, and here's the thing, I think John touched on it. Those of us who upheld, I was very close to the Black Panther Party, and we were fighting to end the murder and killings of people in our communities. What we saw in the world happening was that socialism, Marxism, Leninism was able to beat back and defeat the U.S. capitalists. And so we gravitated toward that ideology because we thought that was the ideology that helped us gain freedom. And, you know, as time goes on, we understood now that we cannot answer that question about what is socialism. You know, is there an example of it that we can look at it? So I think that still, what kind of society that we need to build post-capitalism is up for grabs. But I think that the main thing on the agenda is we have to get rid of capitalism. For every day that it exists, more and more and more people are being put into suffering and misery.
I think it's important to understand how you motivate a country to fight, to get involved in a war. And it can be done only, at least in this country, it can only be done when people feel threatened, endangered. And for the period from the end of the Second World War until the collapse of the Soviet Union, the danger was communism, it was partially ideological and theoretical and quasi-religious in its contradictions or its dangers, but it was mostly, that was the simple way of talking about us being under threat, that somehow our system was on the target line, that, you know, it seems almost ludicrous, but, you know, the issue with Vietnam was not just Vietnam, it was somehow all of Southeast Asia and then all of Asia, and then the whole rest of the world would someday come to threaten us. I think you don't have to go very deeply into the rhetoric now about the Middle East to see the same dynamic. I'm just watching, I mean, the horrors of what is happening now with the refugee flow out of the region, the reaction among the talking heads is that the solution is that the U.S. has to be more involved, has to somehow solve the problem of Syria, and not permit the Russians to be part of solving the problem of Syria, although obviously to solve the problem of Syria will be a lot easier if the Russians are a factor in it. So, you know, it's like, regardless of the time period, what motivates us to engage in a war outside of our territory has to be a sense of danger to ourselves. And whatever the moment of history is, the ideological justification will be provided. And I don't think that's an inherent characteristic of the United States or even an inherent characteristic of capitalism. I think it is an inherent characteristic of societies which have power and enjoy that power and the benefits of that power. I mean, you can see in Chinese behavior towards Vietnam today, and I think in Russian behavior towards Ukraine, exactly the same kind of self-satisfaction of our motives or their motives, and how the actions of intervention in another country are always for defensive reasons, for protecting yourself. Nobody ever acknowledges since the 19th century that you're really doing all of this for your own self-benefit.
Please. Oh, here.
Thank you so much for the presentation and for this book. Our home in Westchester was the central headquarters for the peace movement during those days. And finally, last year, I had a chance to go to Vietnam, and I think nothing has ever moved me so much as to have somebody say, "Welcome to Hanoi." I was so overwhelmed by the unbelievable friendliness of the Vietnamese people when I was there. I also visited some of the projects that American vets had started. I just want to say that those of us from those days, and now that we're looking at what's happening in the world today, are so frustrated. You know, we tend to say, where's the peace movement? Where are our people now? And it's such a different world that I just wonder if any of you have any ideas about that. There are so many of us who are so frustrated by seeing the situation that this country is in yet again.
Yeah, please, won't you say something optimistic about what you see today?
We did a conference in Washington on the 40th anniversary of the end of the war, that is May 1st, 2nd. And it's going to be a while, but at some point all of the speeches will be available on the internet. And people were wrestling with what the lessons were from the experience for today. There are no easy solutions, obviously. It's much easier when you have a single geopolitical enemy, then you can sort of, it's like baseball or football games. You can measure each other's strength and you know how to counteract it. I mean, I think to a certain extent you can say we're reaping the whirlwind. I mean, I cannot believe how many discussions there are of Libya and of Syria that don't bother to go back to the fact that we contributed to the overthrow of an imperfect but stable regime in Libya, and wound up with what? Our allies, our good friends from the Gulf states. I mean, I have no brief for Bashar Assad or his family's role, but what turned one more terrible moment in Syrian history into a calamity for the population was that the Saudis and the Gulf states were sending money, helping people turn a civil conflict into a military conflict and an international conflict. And so the consequences is that you have to, you know, that doesn't mean to me that the solution is somehow we send in our forces and take it over. A, it ain't ever going to work. But B, I think the president is right. It's a political problem. And Kerry can't say, gee, we're really glad the Russians are going in, but he must really be glad the Russians are going in, because all of a sudden there will be the possibility of negotiating something that is not what we would want or the Russians would want, or certainly not something that the people who have seen this as a real testing point of, not just the problems of 50 years, but the problems, the legacy of Western colonialism in the Middle East, that this is the chance to overthrow that, to overturn that history. It's not going to be an easy thing to solve, but you sure don't solve it by sending in U.S. Marines and airborne and drones. You have to be smart, and that's the hard part. Is no history. Yeah, you have to pay attention to your own intelligence, people, and there's all kinds of things that have to happen differently in a lot of countries. I mean, the only note of optimism is that we haven't gone in yet, and we've gone in a partial way, and somehow if we drop bombs, it's okay, but the Russians can't go in and line up their bombs. It's like somehow you have to be able to step back, and it's very, very hard to step back and see solutions.
I have a different take on this, very optimistic, actually. The solution, I've always been a seeker. I want to understand how we manufacture peace on earth as a real thing. And I've given up on worldwide systems and one ideology. It doesn't work. So through my own experience, and I'm a Tai Chi master, practice Tai Chi, and that's a spiritual practice if you do it properly. So I believe that the one thing that we need to do is we need to have transformation. It doesn't come from any political thing. It has to, you have to transform yourself into being a peaceful, loving person. You know, and I can have differences of views on what happened in Vietnam, because I think what the Vietnamese themselves did was nonviolent, myself. It was merely self-defense. But I think that what makes me optimistic is that at the same time people went to Washington, D.C. for this peace conference, there was an event that I went to in the Bay Area, San Francisco, where it was a group primarily of youth, young people, and a lot of them were first generation Vietnamese whose parents were like anti-communists, but who have been in the U.S. for a while and are progressive. And they do things like, some of them have set up a commune where they grow organic crops, where they Vietnamese crops, so they can feed the Vietnamese community off the commune that's being run by alternate renewable energy. At the same week, or 2 weeks before, a group of people, Filipino Americans, chained themselves to the Oakland PD, the Oakland Police Department headquarters, and shut it down, you know, for one day in support of Black Lives Matter. So what I'm seeing is that there has been this 30-year hiatus where the power structure had pretty much shut down, defamed the anti-war movement, and used that to regroup and to make war again. But that can't stop the people. And this new generation that's coming now have lots of ideas, and they mostly are engaging in spiritual practices. And I'm not talking about doing yoga to fix your back pain. I'm talking about that they're doing very serious, very serious meditation. They're trying to understand energy. And what my hope is that the energy that can be manifested when you do practices like Tai Chi, that we learn how to graft that onto social movements. Because what we need is to have a social movement generate a major, major spiritual force of love to stop this madness that's going on. And I see it happening.
And when you get the microphone, will you please identify yourself? I'm sorry I didn't ask those of you before.
Hi, good morning. My name is Bernadette. I'm with Bayan. We're that organization that chained ourselves over in Oakland. I want to thank the panelists for sharing. I also want to thank Alex for pointing out the experiences of being a person of color in the anti-war movement, because that's my experience. I guess I want to bring it more to contemporary times with what's happening right now in the region, in the Asia-Pacific region. While there's no more fighting war, you know, the U.S. is no longer in a fighting war, there's still a lot of U.S. military intervention in the region. The Vietnam War didn't just happen in Vietnam, it happened in the Philippines, it happened in Korea. The bases in those regions were part of the Vietnam War, and those bases never left. So right now, a few years ago, Obama announced the so-called rebalancing of military forces to the Asia-Pacific region, and that's an increasing, escalation of geopolitical strategy, which is 100 years old in the region. So I guess I want to ask, what are your thoughts on what's happening right now? And what is the capacity of the anti-war movement to do something about this right now, in this present day and time?
I'm going to take a position which actually will not be very satisfactory to you, because you have to recognize, we have somebody here who's from the Vietnamese mission to the UN who's joined us. They are very preoccupied with the dangers posed by China. The Philippines is very preoccupied by the dangers posed by China. At a certain level, our agenda is not to have the U.S. withdraw, but have the U.S. to play a respectful and supportive role of the populations of the region to maintain their independence. Not that they should take on dependence on us, but they should be able to have the space to negotiate a reasonable relationship with China, which means the space to have a strong relationship among each other. And that may, things never happen all in the same direction positively. I mean, that may mean that the inequities within the Philippines, for example, do not get addressed as much as they ought to. Though I don't understand enough about Philippine history and politics to separate out the different factors in it. Clearly, the Philippines did achieve the withdrawal of the Americans from Subic Bay, and now wants some greater American presence. And I don't think it's too simple to say that that's just clients of the U.S. coming to power again. I don't know that the U.S. will ever have access to Cam Bay, where my brother served for a year in the U.S. Army. He had great, he happened to be in a position which was not a heavy combat position, but the need for the U.S. to play a role is important for people in the region, whether it fits within our political assumptions or not. And I think you have to listen to what they're saying now, as well as think about the history of 40 years ago, 50 years ago.
I'll just add one thing briefly. In Northeast Asia, the U.S. has continued to demonize North Korea. And one of the things that the Mennonite Central Committee is doing is to continue the dialogue and continue program work in North Korea, to refuse to allow our nation or anyone else to demonize another people, to realize that communication is always better than war. And when in situations of where you can give hope, where you can help people to get an education, where you can help people to get a better life, you will make friends. If you are in a situation where someone is bombing you and destroying your community and your homes and your fields, you will make enemies. And that basic understanding from the Vietnam situation, I think, carries over in many other parts of the world.
Amen, Doug. And of course, I want to, I disagree with John. This is very concerning to me as a Chinese American, because if we go into conflict, anywhere near a conflict, I'm in jail. There's no question about it. And I've been working for peace, and I oppose Chinese aggression, in Asia. And just from a environmental activist, what is China doing putting an oil rig anywhere? We want to keep fossil fuels in the ground. So, but this pivot toward the east is based on a nuclear strategy. We have to be clear on that. And also this Trans-Pacific Partnership that the U.S. is toting around the world encompasses everything that surrounds China. And China's not a part of this thing. The corporations are going to determine how we conduct business in the U.S. In other words, Governor Cuomo put forward a bill to ban fracking in New York. Well, under the Trans-Pacific Partnership, a corporation that feels that this is threatening their profits can have that ban overturned. And this is all aimed at China. So I do not think the solution is for countries to run to the U.S. And I don't think Vietnam will ever do that, to have support via China. And when we had this meeting in the Bay Area, with a lot of young Vietnamese and also a bunch of people who are active in the anti-war movement, there was a lot of talk about resuscitating the idea of Ban Dong, of the non-aligned movement, for people for countries to not align themselves and to build up an alternative to the two new superpowers.
The microphone is.
Hi, my name is Merle Ratner. I'm from the Vietnam Agent Orange Relief and Responsibility Campaign. So I just want to say two things. One, in response to Doug's presentation. He mentioned Agent Orange, and so what we're talking about is not just ancient history. The chemical weapons that the U.S. used on Vietnam, on Laos, on Cambodia, that also impacted the other countries in the region, as well as veterans who were forced to fight in Vietnam, is still killing people, both the veterans, their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. So we have a campaign, and there's a bill in Congress sponsored by Congresswoman Barbara Lee, who's one of the most anti-war members of the House of Representatives. And I'll give out the orange cards for you to sign and either give back now or send back to say you support giving assistance to the Agent Orange victims all over Vietnam and to the children of the veterans here who get almost nothing, surprisingly enough. The veterans themselves get something. The second thing I want to say is in response to Alex's presentation, and I think it's important that the book represent what the anti-war movement was and is. And I think you talked about the important role of people of color in the anti-war movement. I think that needs to be more fully represented, both in the book and more generally, because I think what you find, I mean, the racism that existed in the anti-war movement then still exists now. It's not gone, as somebody who's active then and now. And I think we have to break the idea that the anti-war movement was a white movement and that movements of color were other movements, because that's not true. One of the first groups in the anti-war movement was SNCC. Without Martin Luther King Jr., there would have been no majority anti-war feeling. The other thing is that the veterans need to be represented, who are the working class and also veterans of color. Veterans and also Vietnamese Americans played a key role. And I think when we talk about the anti-war movement, if we're not talking about those folks, we're not accurately portraying and we're not modeling an anti-war movement today that really reflects both the reality and also the growing demographics in this country. And I think if we're talking, just the last point, if we're thinking about things to be hopeful for, the new anti-war movement is developing as part of a broader movement for peace and justice. And I think among that, one of the most hopeful things is Black Lives Matter, which is not just a narrow movement. It's a movement against U.S. militarism at home and abroad. It's a movement against racism and settler colonialism. And with that kind of a movement and the leadership of that kind of movement and movements allied to it, I think we do have a lot of hope. So I'm going to pass these out and please sign them. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I think this book is about making all those connections. We can't legislate how people make those connections in their own lives or even how they see the connections happening in the world. But I appreciate Merle's comment in that this book is here to help make a conversation that has already started in this room, in which people can see the violence on the streets that is instigating and inciting people to join things like Black Lives Matter, that is connected to policies abroad. They're not two separate things. But in part because of our specialties, the number of hours in a day, but also how we frame these issues makes a big difference in who can join and who can relate to the struggles that you described. So it's very true that when SNCC was making its statements around violence in the streets and racism. And then when Dr. King made the connection to the United States as the greatest perpetrator of violence, that was a big no-no for some people. Right away, he was in a sense, punished. And people said, oh, he made a big mistake. We mentioned this in our essay. As editors, Frank and I had the leeway to say our own point of view on the war, and we encapsulate under the editor's perspective, because I still think it is important to have these dialogues and disagreements. But in our view, these movements are connected, and it's important in this current day to allow the space for young people who feel the violence personally on their bodies to know that the connection exists to the violence that we perpetrate abroad. And not only the US, I mean, as Asian Americans, we know that in Asia there's countries fighting each other too. So it's, make no mistake, we're not trying to put ourselves above anyone else. But in the role as Americans, in joining a peace and justice movement, we want those issues to be connected, and we want people to have the space to find those connections for themselves. Are there any last comments, something burning that you would like to say or reinforce? All right, well, with that, we'll close, and perhaps we can have some informal conversation together as we, I think the authors will be happy to sign books, the contributors will be happy to sign books. We're talking about The People Make the Peace, lessons from the Vietnam anti-war movement, with voices from the travelers who went to Vietnam during the war, as well as 5 combat veterans who are interviewed by Myra McPherson. So thank you to Just World Books. Thank you to the our hosts of the Methodist Women.
The Mennonite Central Committee.
Mennonite Central Committee, but who's...
and it is in the room of United Methodist Women.
Oh, so I wasn't totally wrong. So thank you so much for being here, for taking time in your day, and we hope to talk to you in person now. Thank you.